The Battle of Dan no Ura was more than a military confrontation. It was the final, bloody act of a struggle that had consumed Japan for years. As warships collided in the churning straits and black clouds of arrows darkened the sky, the great Taira clan watched its fortunes collapse beneath the waves. Noble families that had dominated the imperial court for generations suddenly found themselves facing total extinction. When the battle finally ended, a child emperor was carried into the sea by his own grandmother, choosing the abyss of the ocean rather than capture by the enemy. For those who witnessed the slaughter, this was not simply the defeat of a rival clan. It was the violent end of one Japan and the brutal birth of another. Power was moving away from the elegant, perfumed halls of the imperial court. It was shifting into the hands of men whose authority rested entirely upon horses, bows, forged steel, unyielding discipline, and sheer violence. The age of the samurai had officially begun. For nearly 7 centuries, from 1185 until 1868, Japan would be shaped by a warrior class completely unlike any other in human history. Dynasties would rise in blood and collapse in ash. Impregnable castles would emerge above misty river valleys and strategic mountain passes. Devastating civil wars would depopulate entire regions. And when long periods of peace eventually replaced the endless conflict, even that peace would be organized around harsh institutions created by warriors. Today, these warriors are largely remembered through myth and legend. Images of gleaming armor, curved katanas, and fearless swordsmen dominate our popular imagination. Yet the historical reality was far more complex, much darker, and far more revealing. The samurai were not merely soldiers. They were ruthless administrators, wealthy landowners, strict judges, and cunning officials. They embodied the highest ideals of discipline and loyalty, but they also participated in treacherous political rivalries, orchestrated assassinations, and fought bitter struggles for absolute power. Their story is not a simple tale of perfect honor. It is the story of a civilization desperately attempting to create order in a deeply fragmented world. To understand how these ruthless warriors took control of an entire nation, we must first look at the world they replaced. Long before the samurai dominated Japan, political life revolved entirely around the imperial court in Kyoto. The emperor occupied the symbolic sacred center of the realm. Around him, aristocratic families competed fiercely for influence, using rank, strategic marriage alliances, and proximity to power as their weapons. In the capital, wealth and prestige were not measured by military achievement. They were measured by refinement, classical education, and cultural accomplishment. Noblemen composed delicate poetry beneath flowering cherry trees, while scholars meticulously copied Chinese classics. But this isolated bubble of elegance and ritual could not govern a wild, geographically fractured country. Beyond the capital's manicured gardens, another Japan existed. Rugged mountains divided the islands into countless isolated regions. Dense forests covered vast landscapes. Travel remained perilous, and communication moved at a crawl. Out in these distant wild provinces, local leaders often exercised far more practical day-to-day authority than the imperial officials sitting hundreds of miles away in Kyoto. As the central government struggled to maintain direct control over these remote territories, they began outsourcing their military needs. Powerful provincial families were tasked with keeping the peace, collecting taxes, and subduing rebellions. To do this, these families accumulated their own land, their own wealth, and their own armed followers. Over generations, these provincial elites developed a completely different culture, one shaped not by poetry, but by conflict, martial prowess, and survival. They trained obsessively in mounted combat. They mastered the asymmetric bow, and they cultivated intense networks of personal loyalty that permanently bound retainers to their local lords. From this harsh, unforgiving environment, the samurai emerged. The word samurai originally referred to those who serve, and service became the absolute foundation of their identity. A samurai existed within a strict, inescapable hierarchy of obligations. Loyalty to one's lord was not simply encouraged, it was demanded upon pain of death. Courage on the battlefield was admired, but blind obedience often mattered far more. Individual ambition could bring a warrior glory, yet uncontrolled ambition could result in the execution of his entire clan. This mindset was drilled into them from childhood. A samurai boy's training began long before sunrise. He learned to ride horses without hands, fire arrows at a full gallop, and wield bladed weapons with lethal precision. He absorbed the stories of ancestors who had fought, bled, and died in service to their families. He was taught a harsh truth. Discipline is not a fleeting moment of courage on the battlefield. Discipline is a habit practiced every single day. These grim values would eventually coalesce into what later generations called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Although the code evolved over centuries, its core themes remained remarkably consistent. Duty mattered more than comfort. Service mattered more than personal desire. Honor was not simply a reputation. It was the very foundation upon which all political authority rested. As these warrior families grew stronger, military power gradually became inseparable from political authority. By the late 12th century, this shifting power dynamic culminated in the Genpei War, a devastating 5-year conflict between the two greatest warrior clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. Across coastlines, river valleys, sacred temples, and burning towns, vast armies marched in pursuit of total supremacy. When the Minamoto clan finally emerged victorious, wiping out their rivals at the aforementioned Battle of Dan-no-Ura, their leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, understood a profound lesson that many conquerors throughout history have completely failed to grasp. Winning a war is not the same thing as creating stability. Military victory could destroy a current enemy, but without strong, newly forged institutions capable of managing thousands of ambitious warriors and competing land interests, peace would remain temporary. Therefore, in 1192, Yoritomo forced the court to grant him the title of shogun, establishing a military government in Kamakura. Officially, the emperor remained securely on the throne in Kyoto. In practice, however, a completely new political order had emerged. True power now flowed through warrior institutions, not courtly ones. The samurai had officially become the architects of Japan's future. For a time, their system of land distribution and sworn loyalty appeared remarkably successful. But beneath the surface, intense geopolitical pressures were accumulating. And before long, this delicate warrior government would be tested by an apocalyptic threat unlike anything Japan had ever faced. The warning did not come from a rival domestic clan. It came from across the sea. In 1274, less than a century after the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate, the terrifying forces of the Mongol Empire appeared on the horizon. By this time, the Mongols had violently conquered vast territories stretching from the coasts of China all the way to Eastern Europe. Entire kingdoms had fallen before their armies. Great cities that resisted had been erased from the map. Their reputation traveled ahead of them like a storm of ash. For the samurai of Japan, this was a tactical nightmare. Traditional warfare in Japan often revolved around elite, individual warriors seeking personal glory. They would ride out, announce their lineage, and demonstrate skill through mounted archery and single combat. The Mongols fought completely differently. Their armies operated with a brutal, collective discipline, using coordination and tactics refined across thousands of miles of ruthless conquest. War drums signaled rapid troop movements. Massed volleys of poisoned arrows darkened the sky. Infantry and cavalry maneuvered as interlocking parts of a massive, lethal machine. When the invaders landed, the Japanese defenders encountered a style of total warfare that threatened every assumption they had about battle itself. Yet, against all odds, Japan survived. The initial invasion of 1274 ended in a Mongol withdrawal after fierce resistance, and a second, vastly larger invasion fleet in 1281 met an even more dramatic fate. As thousands of Mongol ships gathered along the Japanese coast, violent, unprecedented typhoons swept through the region. Massive ships shattered against one another in the dark. Tens of thousands of invaders drowned in the chaos. Chroniclers would later describe these tempests as the divine winds, the kamikaze, sent by the gods to preserve the islands from absolute conquest. This miraculous victory saved the nation, but it fatally wounded the samurai system. The samurai had repelled the greatest empire on earth, but the cracks in their system were beginning to show, setting the stage for the most violent era in Japanese history. If you are captivated by the brutal, unyielding march of the past, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which historical conflict you want us to dissect next. Your support keeps history reborn. The fatal flaw of the Mongol victory came down to economics. The samurai who bled and died to defend Japan expected tangible rewards for their service. In all previous domestic wars, successful campaigns produced confiscated lands and resources that could be distributed among loyal retainers. But this time, there was no conquered territory to divide. The Mongol enemy had been repelled into the sea, not conquered. Glory was abundant, but material compensation was non-existent. Over time, severe economic strain spread like a virus through the warrior class. Many samurai accumulated massive debts just to maintain their armor, weapons, and horses. Landholdings fragmented across generations. The Kamakura political system continued functioning on paper, yet the financial balance upon which it depended grew incredibly fragile. Loyalty remained essential, but maintaining that loyalty required resources the shogun simply did not have. By the early 14th century, this invisible economic pressure finally broke the system. Seeing the weakness of the military government, Emperor Go-Daigo launched an ambitious rebellion in 1331 to restore direct imperial rule. The Kamakura shogunate collapsed in 1333, but the emperor's dream of returning to the old days of courtly rule was an illusion. The military structures that had elevated the samurai were now too deeply embedded within the DNA of society. Warrior elites possessed the land, the influence, and the armies. Almost immediately, new warlords emerged from the political vacuum to seize control. Among them was Ashikaga Takauji, a ruthless general who crushed the emperor's forces and established the Ashikaga shogunate. But this second samurai government inherited the exact same structural nightmare as the first. How do you govern a deeply fragmented, heavily armed country without empowering local rulers so much that they eventually declare independence? The Ashikaga shoguns never found a lasting answer. Their control over distant provinces deteriorated rapidly. Regional lords, known as daimyo, expanded their personal domains, building massive military networks capable of operating completely without central approval. The illusion of a unified Japan finally shattered in 1467. A bitter dispute over succession within the ruling elite escalated into the Onin War, a catastrophic conflict that transformed the glorious capital of Kyoto itself into a slaughterhouse. What began as a political disagreement evolved into a 10-year bloodbath that consumed the very heart of Japanese civilization. Ancient temples burned to the ground. Aristocratic residences collapsed into rubble. Armies fought block by block among the ruins of the capital. Trade ceased entirely, and the central administrative institutions simply evaporated. When the Onin conflict finally burned itself out in 1477, there were no clear victors. There was only a massive, terrifying power vacuum. This collapse of central authority ushered in the Sengoku Jidai, the era of warring states. For more than a century, Japan fractured into dozens of fiercely competing domains ruled by absolute warlords. Alliances were formed and betrayed with astonishing speed. Massive stone castles multiplied across strategic landscapes. Vast armies marched year after year through valleys, forests, and plains, turning the entire country into a permanent war zone. This was the samurai era in its most intense, unrestricted form. Behind the romanticized clashes of armies stood millions of ordinary human lives. Peasants planted their crops terrified, uncertain whether their harvest would survive the next military campaign. Villages desperately shifted allegiances depending upon which army currently occupied their hills. Entire generations were born, lived, and died in a world where extreme violence seemed completely permanent. For the samurai themselves, this age of chaos offered incredible opportunity and lethal danger. Military success could elevate a lowly foot soldier from obscurity to immense regional power. A single tactical failure could result in the execution of an entire lineage. Men swore blood oaths, broke alliances, forged new partnerships, and adapted to rapidly changing geopolitics. The ideal of honor endured in text, but the reality of survival was ruthless and pragmatic. It was out of this crucible of endless war that a new type of leader was born. Among the dozens of warlords slaughtering each other for dominance, Oda Nobunaga recognized that Japan's endless cycle of warfare could not continue, and he was prepared to rewrite the rules of war entirely to stop it. Nobunaga understood something that his traditionalist rivals completely failed to grasp. Power now belonged to those willing to adapt faster than their opponents. When Portuguese traders first introduced matchlock firearms to Japan in 1543, many proud samurai viewed them as cowardly, curious foreign toys. Nobunaga, however, saw a massive paradigm shift. He realized that gunpowder could reshape the battlefield just as the horse and the bow had done centuries prior. He proved his theory at the pivotal Battle of Nagashino in 1575. Nobunaga deployed disciplined, rotating formations of peasant gunners behind wooden palisades, unleashing continuous volleys that completely shattered the terrifying, elite cavalry charges of his rivals. The sword remained central to a samurai's soul, but technology was changing the grim calculus of war. Brutal logistics, mass organization, and technological innovation now determined who lived and who died. Nobunaga spent years ruthlessly conquering rivals and crushing ancient institutions, but before he could complete the absolute unification of Japan, he was betrayed by his own general and forced to commit seppuku in 1582. His vision for a unified state, however, survived the flames. His loyal general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued the bloody work. Rising from the ranks of the peasantry, Hideyoshi proved that the chaos of the Sengoku era rewarded raw, brilliant tactical talent over noble bloodlines. Through masterful diplomacy and overwhelming military campaigns, Hideyoshi gradually brought the fractured islands under a single, iron-fisted authority. To ensure this new peace would hold, Hideyoshi implemented strict, inescapable structure. He confiscated weapons from the peasantry in the famous sword hunts, permanently freezing the social classes. Farmers could no longer become warriors, and warriors could no longer farm. Hideyoshi's death, however, left a dangerous power vacuum, leading to the ultimate historical showdown. In the year 1600, on the foggy fields of Sekigahara, the two greatest military coalitions in Japan gathered for one final, apocalyptic struggle. Tens of thousands of armored warriors marched beneath the banners of competing visions for Japan's future. When the mud dried and the fighting ended, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood victorious. In 1603, he became the undisputed shogun, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate, a fiercely authoritarian government that would rule Japan with an iron grip for more than 2.5 centuries. Unlike every previous regime, the Tokugawa system achieved the impossible. It created enduring, unshakable stability. Large-scale warfare completely disappeared. The shogun heavily restricted outside contact and forced regional lords to spend half their time in the new capital of Edo, keeping them politically monitored and financially exhausted. Commerce expanded rapidly, and Edo, the city that would later become Tokyo, swelled into one of the largest, most vibrant urban centers in the entire world. But for the samurai, this engineered peace triggered an existential crisis. Hundreds of thousands of apex predators suddenly found themselves with no wars to fight. Warriors who had trained their entire lives for combat were forced to serve as bureaucratic administrators, tax collectors, poets, and civic officials. The legendary katana remained tucked into their belts, yet fewer and fewer samurai would ever draw it in actual anger. The warrior class survived, but its true function had evaporated. It was in this deeply sanitized, peaceful environment that the philosophical ideals of Bushido were truly codified. Loyalty, discipline, and self-control were fiercely emphasized, not as practical battlefield tactics, but as moral principles for governing a peaceful society. The samurai transitioned from agents of extreme violence into the aristocratic custodians of an idealized moral order. Yet, this monumental success carried a hidden terminal disease. Over the next 2 centuries, economic reality evolved much faster than the rigid social hierarchy. Merchants, officially the lowest class in society, accumulated massive wealth. The samurai, paid in fixed stipends of rice, grew impoverished and heavily indebted to the very merchants they supposedly outranked. The official government structure remained completely rigid, while the tectonic plates of society shifted beneath it. The institutions that had successfully created stability had become entirely incapable of adapting to change. This fragile, frozen society was finally shattered in 1853 when the outside world arrived. American naval commander Matthew Perry sailed into Japanese waters with a fleet of massive, steam-powered, iron-hulled warships. Their technology reflected the brutal reality of the global industrial age. For the samurai on the shore, the sight of the black ships was deeply terrifying. The rigid military order that had governed Japan in isolation for centuries was suddenly, glaringly obsolete. Political divisions rapidly tore the country apart. Confidence in the shogun collapsed. Traditionalists demanded the expulsion of the foreigners, while reformers realized Japan had to rapidly industrialize or face colonization. The pressure that had been building beneath the surface of the long peace finally detonated. In 1868, a brief but decisive civil war led to the total collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate. Power was restored to the emperor during the Meiji Restoration. The samurai era was officially dead. The new, modernizing government rapidly embraced industrialization. Steel railways scarred the ancient landscapes. Massive factory smokestacks replaced the silhouettes of wooden castles. A modern, conscripted national army wielding repeating rifles completely replaced the elite warrior retainers. Traditional privileges were abolished, and the exclusive, sacred right to carry swords faded into the history books. Yet the deep legacy of the samurai endures. The true story of the samurai era is not simply one of cinematic battles or legendary swordmasters. It is the story of a civilization desperately searching for equilibrium across nearly 7 centuries of violent change. Again and again, visionary leaders built complex institutions to solve the bloody problems of their age. And again, those very solutions eventually became the chains that suffocated future generations. It is the ultimate price that civilizations always pay for permanence. The structures built to preserve order will inevitably resist adaptation. The institutions that create peace will always struggle to survive transformation. When we look closely at our modern world, the echoes from Japan's past feel uncomfortably familiar. Our technologies evolve at breakneck speed. Global economies shift beneath our feet. Our political systems confront unprecedented challenges. Yet, the central, defining question remains remarkably unchanged. How does a civilization preserve order without becoming trapped by it? That question followed the samurai into the grave of history, and it continues to follow us today.